We are on page 5 of tonight's handout. We're only one session behind, and maybe we'll catch up a little bit. But let's see if you can remember, this is the third time we reviewed this, and this, I'm hoping, is one of my lasting legacies in your lives, that you'll be able to think about the whole Bible in terms of the good news of Jesus Christ. So the Old Testament is the preparation for the gospel. And the Gospels are the manifestation. The manifestation. It's not a word we use a lot, but I got to have a bunch of words that end in T-I-O-N, you see. That's right. Message would be too easy, and it doesn't end in T-I-O-N. So the Gospels are the manifestation of the good news. Acts describes the expansion of the good news. We're not going to do it right now, but if you thought about the New Testament and you had Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and then you had the epistles, you wouldn't be able to put them together. It's like, what? Where do these epistles come from? Or where do the Gospels come from? But Acts gives us the expansion, and it gives us the link between Jesus and his teachings and his life and death, resurrection, and then all the rest of the New Testament. The epistles provide the explanation, or if you like to be fancy, if you're a literature teacher, the explication of the gospel. You know, they break it down and they explain facets of it. And then Revelation describes the culmination or consummation, whichever word you like better. Culmination or consummation. So this helps us place John. John is a gospel which takes its place in pointing to and in articulating the good news. The gospel does not list its author. There's been a lot of speculation regarding his identity in the annals of church history going back really into the first century. The Apostle John was regarded as the writer. This verdict has the attraction of important points of support from the gospel itself. Foremost among these is that the disciple whom Jesus loved is almost certainly to be identified with the Apostle John. The same figure wrote these things, and he sometimes refers to himself either in the third person, the person who saw these things, you know he is true or whatever, he's honest, or he'll refer to himself as we, that is, he and others who saw the same thing. We can raise objections against Johannine authorship, but these objections, I think, can be answered, and there's been no plausible alternative to John's authorship. For those of you who did go to seminary in the last half century, you know that it's commonplace to talk about a Johannine school. And the idea is that John didn't write it, but disciples of John wrote it kind of as if it had come from him, and that's why it was associated with him, but actually it wasn't. And people at the highest level of so-called critical scholarship have admitted in the last 10 years that the Johannine school hypothesis cannot be verified. So even the people who 10, 15 years ago would have been saying, well, it came from a school in John's name, that theory has been discredited now. That doesn't mean they think John wrote it. They just now say, we don't know who wrote it. But they can't even say a Johannine school wrote it. You will read, and you didn't read it in Elwell Yarbrough, but if you read about this, you'll read that all the Gospels are anonymous. You'll read that. And they say that because they say the Gospel circulated without the titles. In Greek, the title of every Gospel is kata mataion, according to Matthew, according to Mark, according to Luke, according to John, so forth. However, everybody knows that we don't have the first copy of what the gospel writers wrote. And the critics of all people will say, we don't have any of the original manuscripts. So how do they know that it didn't say on the documents who wrote it. How did they know it? They can't know that. And if actually these were all anonymous, and then later on they said, well, let's call this one Matthew. We have thousands of manuscripts that come from various parts of the ancient world that have these titles on them. What's the chances that not one copy of Matthew has, well, I don't know, Luke on it, or Peter, or why not Paul, by a vision or something? So the uniformity of the titles of the Gospels, I think, argues strongly against the fact that later on people looked at these anonymous documents and just sort of pulled a name out of the air and affixed the title to the documents. The only title it's associated, the only name it's associated with John's Gospel is John. And we can trace that John back, like I say, into at least the AD 90s, maybe earlier. So let's say that he is the author. Now, in the Enlightenment mode, because John does ascribe deity to Jesus in such a graphic way, there was the notion that, A, he couldn't have been God. B, this would have taken time to develop, this legend to be told and retold, and more and more fantasies to have arisen. So maybe by the year AD 200, John's Gospel was written, because by that time the legend could have grown enough that you have this divine second person of the Trinity. However, a fragment of the Gospel found in Egypt has been dated to about AD 125, plus or minus 25 years. Handwriting experts, they call them paleographers. They can date the ancient writing. And this was found in a garbage dump in Egypt. So it had to have been written long enough prior to AD 125 to have circulated and got thrown away in a garbage dump. So it certainly wasn't written as late as AD 200. In recent decades, scholars have moved more in the direction of an earlier date, and some have placed it even before AD 70. We can't date it, within 10 or 20 years. Some like the theory that John composed his account in the second or third decade after Jesus rose, and then later, with the help of others, prepared it for wider distribution. So the idea there would be that it was composed in a couple stages. These theories are important because they give people something to write doctoral dissertations about. But for our purposes, the main thing is that John wrote it. He wrote it in the first century. Whether in the 60s, whether in the 80s or 90s, it's not that critical if, in fact, he's describing what Jesus said and did. What difference does it make what decade it was written in? It's not a big issue. Here's in the epilogue, John says, this is the disciple who is bearing witness about these things and who has written these things, and we know that his testimony is true. So that could just be the editorial we. He's speaking about himself. Others think that he's speaking as part of a circle of people who knew him and who maybe had witnessed some of the things that he had said. When he wrote that, it's disputable. Place of writing, the best evidence, I think, is from Irenaeus, about AD 180. And Irenaeus, when he was a boy, heard Polycarp. Polycarp was martyred in the AD 160s, and Polycarp was a disciple of John the Apostle. So Irenaeus heard a pastor who had been taught by John the Apostle, and Irenaeus said, John fled Jerusalem when the Roman forces marched on Jerusalem in the AD 60s. Remember, Jesus had said, when you see this destruction coming, flee. And so they did. And he ended up in Ephesus, and he became a pastor in the area of the 7 churches that are written to in Revelation: Smyrna, Ephesus, Philadelphia, Laodicea, Pergamum, whatever all cities are, Thyatira. John was a pastor in that area. He could have written it earlier than that, but, you know, it's very tempting to think of him pastoring in Jerusalem, as we know he did with James and Peter, down to the time of James' martyrdom and then the outbreak of the Jewish Civil War around AD 64. There was war going on in Jerusalem among the Jews before the Romans ever came in and destroyed Jerusalem. That's why they destroyed Jerusalem. They got tired of all the civil unrest in Judea, and they kept warning him. And remember, even in the gospel, it's in John's gospel, one of the guys in the Sanhedrin says, we've got to stop this Jesus movement because the Romans will come and take away our place in our city. If this political mess and social upheaval continues. And it did, not because people accepted Jesus, but because they didn't. And so John was busy. He was busy pastoring until the AD 60s. Then, according to the best tradition we have, he goes to Ephesus, and it could well have been at this time that he composes a gospel that can be circulated in the churches that he has jurisdiction over. And this is then the knowledge of Jesus that the churches in Asia, that was the name of the province of the seven churches of Revelation, were in an area that the Romans called Asia. And John would have been then sort of, you call it the official gospel of Asia, or at least the one that John himself sanctioned. So I kind of think that it works to have it coming from the Ephesus area, especially when you study both Acts on Ephesus and when you study the book of Ephesians. Ephesus was the site of one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, the Temple of Diana. And it was to the occult what Las Vegas is to gambling. It was the center of occult worship of the Roman Empire. And when you read Ephesians, you see there's a great stress on what's called cosmic Christology, Christ's rule over the world, which would seem not true if you went to Ephesus. It would seem like all these gods and goddesses and demons and spirits rule the world, but not so. Christ is Lord over the world, even at Ephesus. And corresponding to that, Jesus is clearly the Son of God who is over all. He has a cosmic lordship, and that would be a very appropriate stress if you were pastoring in the area of Asia Minor, or of the province of Asia, because that's the place where appearance would have it. Boy, there are a lot of gods and goddesses in the world. So everything's up for grabs. No, nothing's up for grabs. God is sovereign, and it's through the Son who was instrumental in making all things. John writes in a simple fashion, and beginning students of Greek find his writings the easiest of all New Testament writings to read. The same elegant simplicity characterizes the English translation. A lot of short sentences, simple diction, but the straightforward language conveys inexhaustible profundity, like 1:1. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. That's profound. Simple but profound. And you can see there the pool. Beginner can wade and an elephant can swim. And I say a couple other things there. I don't think I said it. I may have said it. John has a style that's very consistent throughout John's gospel. And it's just something to notice. And it reminds me, I was an English major, it reminds me of Ernest Hemingway. Everything that Ernest Hemingway writes, it sounds the same. And all the writers, or all the speakers, kind of speak in the same style. And that's the way John is. Pilate, Jesus, the Pharisees, the disciples, they all use the same vocabulary. They all talk in the same kinds of sentences. And that gives a certain uniformity to the Gospel of John. And it contrasts most of all with Luke. Because in Luke, he's very careful to reflect the setting so that Stephen doesn't sound like Peter in Acts. And when Paul preaches, it's very different than any of Peter's sermons or discourses. So Luke, either through his research and or his other sources and in conjunction with his literary genius, he reflects the specific time and location and language of the people that he reports on. But for John, everybody kind of gets cooked down into the same language. And that's just his style of writing. And for those of us who teach Greek and read Greek, it's a blessing. Because it's hard enough to read all this without getting into Luke's ridiculous vocabulary. Remember, every chapter of Luke and every chapter of Acts, on average, has 10 words in it that you don't see anywhere else in the whole New Testament. So it's torture to read those things because it's so depressing, because you think you know Greek and you keep running into words you never saw before. John, once you get his basic vocabulary, it's very encouraging to read John. It's deceptive. You don't know as much as you think you know, but you think you know. You think you can read the Greek in John. John specifically states that his motive is to engender belief. And it's worth looking at that verse 20:31. In fact, we should go back a verse. Jesus did many other signs. We have a man here who did a dissertation on the signs, the semea, so if you want to know, ask Jim. In the presence of the disciples, which are not written in this book, but these are written, so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. This can be understood as an evangelistic urge. John is writing to unbelievers in order to lead them to commit their lives to Christ. However, there is a textual variant there in the Greek, and depending on how you take the variant, and commentators go in different ways here, he could be understood not to be trying to evangelize the lost, but to confirm believers in their faith, to confirm or correct or enlarge on the faith they have. Of course, these two things don't have to be seen as in conflict with each other. What is indisputable is that he writes with a deeper purpose than simply to inform. Like all the Gospels, John's Gospel is not just a list of things that happened, a chronicle. It's a careful selection of incidents and teachings from all that he could have written. One of you, I think, might have commented on the very end of John, where he says there's a lot of other things that could have been said, but if I went on about everything, the world itself could not contain the books that might be written. There are many other things that Jesus did. Were every one of them written, I suppose the world itself could not contain the books that would be written. So he picks and chooses what he wants to have, and again, it's about the size of what would fit on a scroll. So he couldn't say a whole lot more unless he wanted 2 volumes. John transmits historically sound data, but pitches it in such a way that his readers would, like the characters in the gospel, be brought face to face with the intense conflict, yet promise which attended contact with Jesus of Nazareth. You see a lot of skepticism in John's gospel. You overhear the conversations, not only between Jesus and his enemies, but the enemies with each other. Or people that say, well, maybe this is the Messiah. They say, oh, you don't know anything. You're idiots. We're the ones that know. We're the intelligentsia. You're just the people of the land. You don't know. So there's a lot of conflict. But then the resolution of the conflict is found in the person of the main character of the book. When the reader finally perceives the ultimate implication of the claims of Jesus, whom the resurrection shows to be the Christ, on his personal life, John 14:6, of course, is, I am the way, the truth, and the life. When he answers the crucified yet risen Jesus' summons to follow with the confession of a convert, no longer paralyzed by disbelief, when your faith moves beyond mere credence to the obedient response Scripture calls love for Christ, then John's purpose in writing has been achieved. He's trying to set up the conditions under which, in which, through which God connects with a sinful person, child, teenager, adult, young, old. You know, we can hear all about Jesus, but every one of us has a story about how God got through to us. And it was through Jesus. But just a Jesus story is not the end of the reason Jesus came. He didn't come to say, look, this is my story, and if you believe in my story, you'll go to heaven. Jesus came with an attitude. He got nose to nose with people. He said and taught all kinds of things. And best case scenario, it got to people. Like Nicodemus, you know, it broke him down. And I think he's not broken down yet in John 3, but after Jesus is crucified and he and Joseph of Arimathea come to get Jesus' body, I bet they were surprised to see each other. Like, oh, you're here? Because they were secret disciples. But they run into each other. See, the Jesus thing broke them down. And it drew them into a compulsion. They had to respond to God. And that's what Jesus does. He mediates God to us. So it's great. It's great to believe in the stories, but this obedient response Scripture calls love. Love for God, the personal knowledge of God in which we say we know His love, and our devotion, our inner devotion is directed to God, and we connect. So we don't just fling it out into the stratosphere somewhere. We connect with God, and He connects with us. You know, that's what Jesus came, and that's what John's Gospel comes to mediate. All right, it's break time already.